So friends, we turn to our scripture for this morning and reading from Numbers chapter 21 and just from verse 4 to verse 9. And so the Israelites travelled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." And so Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." And so Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. Just reading so far this morning. So friends, we were speaking, as I said earlier, during this time leading up to Easter about the different cups that we have to drink. Some cups are joyful, some cups are cups of sorrow. We're going to look in due course at the cup of blessing. But ultimately, we are called as Christ followers to journey and to drink the cup of life. Our challenge for the first 3 weeks of Lent is to ask what it means to hold the cup before us, to examine it, to know what our life is about. And so we looked last week at holding the cup as the connoisseur would hold up a glass of wine and smell it and look at it and swirl it and taste it. This week we're looking at what it means to hold the cup of sorrow. Next week we'll look at what it means to hold the cup of joy. So perhaps we can speak about some of our sorrows this morning. And I wonder what the cup of sorrow is that you have to drink. What is a cup of sorrow that you have to hold before you? For us, certainly, it was Alex's diagnosis. First, the journey from the 20-week scan, knowing that he was going to have an operation, and then receiving the news that he has cystic fibrosis and everything that goes with that. The sorrow of recognizing that perhaps you'll have a very short life. The sorrow of recognizing that our own hopes for the future have been very much changed, wanting to have a family and have other children, and recognizing there's going to be, well, there's a high probability that a second child will also have cystic fibrosis, but also recognizing that Alex is going to need so much of care that it's going to be unfair to have a second child who will always be neglected. And so we all face these cups of sorrow where suddenly life isn't what we wanted it to be, life isn't what we expected it to be or what we hoped for it to be, and we need to deal with that cup of sorrow. And I know each one of us here has also had different sorrows, whether that's the death of a loved one, or the diagnosis of an illness, or financial difficulty. Each of us have had that moment where we've sat down and we've received news that we haven't wanted to hear. We received a cup that we haven't wanted to drink. And so today we're looking at holding up the cup of sorrow. And I think as we go on, we'll discover, particularly next week, that we'll discover that the same cup of sorrow is also the cup of joy when we learn to drink it. The line is going to be speaking about that next week. But very often the first response that we have when we receive bad news, when we suddenly realize that the cup which we're holding is full of sorrow, is how can we avoid drinking this? How can we escape it? How can we escape this thing which is happening in our life? And very often I think we want to escape it because we're afraid. We don't know what it means for us. We don't know what it's going to mean for us to care for Alex for the rest of his life, however long that may be. We don't know how to deal with people who themselves are going through a time of sorrow. And so when somebody else goes through a difficult time, whether that's losing a loved one or whatever it is, we don't know what to say to them. And so we may try to avoid the subject. And so when our sorrows seem too great for us to do anything about, we often try to pretend they don't exist. We look at our own country, for example, and the enormous challenges that we face, the enormous levels of poverty. And we almost, when we're in a position of privilege, we pretend that poverty doesn't exist. We're comfortable in our houses, we're comfortable with our family, we're comfortable with people around us who seem to have the same amount of stuff that we have, and we forget that perhaps the majority of the country, the majority of the population, have very, very little indeed. And so we flee the cup of sorrow by denial, simply by life choices, and ensure we don't have to deal with those things. We're working our way through this book called Can You Drink the Cup? It's written by Henri Nouwen, who was a Catholic priest. He speaks from a very personal space in these chapters. He was called to work in a centre for handicapped people called L'Arche, Daybreak. And he describes how when he first arrived, he was so afraid of all the sorrow that he had to face, the sorrow of adults who had the intellect of children, who couldn't dress or look after themselves, the sorrow of their parents in dealing with that situation, the sorrow of, on the other hand, people who are highly intelligent but who were paralyzed and couldn't do anything for themselves. He speaks of how difficult it was for him to come into this community of sorrow. For each person that he met had this cup of sorrow that they were holding and trying to drink. He says of one young man, he says, "When I first met Adam, I was afraid of him. His many handicaps made him a stranger to me, a man I wanted to avoid." And I wonder if those words would describe our interactions, or lack thereof, with many people, other people, but perhaps also with ourselves, also with the sorrows that we face. We recognize our handicaps, and we want to avoid them because they make us look bad. And so we avoid perhaps people with HIV, or somebody who's terminally ill, or somebody who seems to be an outsider in the community, because we don't know how to respond to them. We don't know how to respond to somebody who lives differently to the way we do. We don't know how to respond to somebody who believes differently to the way we do. We don't care for them as we ought to, because our fear of the difference, our fear of the sorrow, makes others strangers. We don't know what to do, and we don't know what to say. I find it interesting that the origin of the word holy means that which is set apart, or is another way of saying that which is other, that which is different. And if we accept that, then so often when we approach the other, when we approach the stranger, when we approach the one that we don't know how to relate to, the one who frightens us, when we do that in an attitude of humility rather than hostility, then we do encounter the holy. And I think that's what Nouwen's saying in his book. When we approach sorrow, the cup of sorrow, in our own lives and other people's lives, as we do that humbly, not arrogantly, but humbly, we encounter the holy. As he goes on to tell his story, he speaks about how those things that he was afraid of, because they were so different, because of the depths of sorrow, ultimately became for him a place and a source of joy. So this morning we look at the cup of sorrow, and next week Lionel will speak to us about the cup of joy. As we're invited to lift up our cup and to look at the cup and to see what our cup holds, holding up the cup of sorrows invites us calls us to confront our sorrows head on. Not to avoid them, not to put them to one side, not to deny the reality, not to flee from them, but to confront them head on. And it's so important for us to do that because we've become so good at avoiding the things which make us sad. And I think there's been a big change in our communities over the last 200 years. 200 years ago, sorrow was very close to home. We expected death. There was a high infant mortality rate. Many of our babies would die right there in the home, maybe in childbirth. John Wesley's mother, Susanna, had 19 children and 11 survived. But it was common for that time. 200 years ago, life expectancy was short, and many times people would die in the home. It's almost, in our modern society, we expect medicine to do miracles. We expect that people shouldn't get sick. We expect people shouldn't die. And when death does happen, it's far removed from us. It's in a hospital or a hospice. And so we've created a life for ourselves in which we've removed all the sad things. We remove death. We want to flee our sorrows. And we think that we'll be happier, or perhaps happier with more things, or more alcohol, or more drugs, more things to avoid the sorrow. And so much of our life has become about that. So much of our life is about avoiding the things that make us sad, whether it's a bigger house or a newer car or whatever it is. And I don't know if you've had the experience of ever really, really wanting something. And you think, if only I have that, I'll be happy. If only I can get to that place in my life. If only. And you work for it, and you save for it, and finally you get it, and then you look at it and think, well, this thing doesn't really make me happy. Like a kid who anticipates Christmas and anticipates the toys, and 2 hours after playing with it is bored. And so very often the mistake that we make is to go chasing after the next thing that's going to make me happy, the next thing that's going to help me to avoid the pain. And so often, while these things may lead to short-term happiness, ultimately they lead to long-term misery. We can only discover true joy, the joy that God wants for us, by drinking from the cup of sorrow. Perhaps we can say short-term misery for long-term joy. Nouwen tells a story of life at the Daybreak community and the volunteers who come to assist from all over the world. He says people of different ages, from different countries, different religions, they are there to assist these wounded, broken people in their care. These people who are all drinking from the cup of sorrow. And he says as they do that, they discover that their own weaknesses are shown up. And they discover their own sorrows about broken families and sexual unfulfillment and spiritual alienation and confusing relationships. You see, confronting the cup of sorrows in other people, confronting the cup of sorrows in the world, confronting the cup of sorrows in our community, forces us to confront the sorrows in our own lives. Maybe that's why drinking the cup of sorrow makes us so uncomfortable. Maybe that's why we flee from the sorrows of others, because we don't want to be reminded of our own sorrows. We don't want to be reminded of the sorrows of the world, sorrows that we often feel powerless to do anything about. What do we do about the poverty we see all around us here in Cape Town? What do we do with those living with HIV? What do we do with people who are looking for work? And what about hurt people elsewhere? Victims of earthquakes and natural disasters, victims of meaningless wars and genocide, victims of shooting like we heard about in New Zealand just the other day. What message do we have to give them? If there's so much sorrow as Christ followers, what message can we share with them? My mother always says that she can't believe in God because if God were real, He wouldn't allow human suffering. The cup of sorrow is the cup of human suffering. Our own sorrows are deeply personal. Those things which I mentioned earlier, our journey with Alex, many of the things which we have confronted in our lives, deeply personal, and yet also deeply universal, because everybody goes through it. And the answer that we have is Jesus, the man of sorrows. A man who hangs on a cross with outstretched arms, a man who is lifted above the earth as a spectacle of agony for the entire universe to watch. And together with Jesus, in the midst of our cup of sorrows, we cry out, God, our God, why have you forsaken us? Friends, Jesus refused to allow the cup to pass him by. He didn't throw it away in despair. He didn't say, I'm not drinking this. He kept it in his hands, willing to drink it to the dregs. And as he does that, he says in a very deep and real way, he says yes to his Father. He says yes to Abba, the healer of the wounded heart. And so here's what I want to say this morning. I'm sure I've said it already, but perhaps I need to say it again. The way we deal with the cup of sorrow, the way we transform the cup of sorrow into a cup of joy, isn't by avoiding it, isn't by thinking if you don't go there it's going to be okay. We transform the cup by drinking it. As Jesus agonized in the Garden of Gethsemane, we read this in Luke chapter 22, verses 42 to 43. He says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And so let me close off with a short reflection from Numbers. A story in Numbers is a very strange one. It's a story which is difficult to understand literally. How can this happen in real life? A bunch of people misbehaved, so God punished them by sending snakes to bite them. And then in order to fix it, once they have suitably repented, they have to look at the idol of a snake hanging on a pole. An idol of the very thing that bit them. And it makes them well again. It doesn't make sense to take that story literally, but it makes a whole lot of sense if you take it metaphorically. If you recognize that the lesson in the story is about drinking from the cup. So there's a situation, we've received bad news, whatever it is. We don't want to drink the cup of sorrow which we're holding up before us. It's whatever it is, whatever you may have thought about this morning. And this is what happened. When we refuse to drink the cup, and start complaining about the circumstances of our life. We don't have enough water, we don't have enough food, we don't like what we do have to drink. Why have you brought us here? When we start complaining about our circumstances in life, we will surely die. The snakes will come and bite us, and we will suffer and die from the venom. And we're so busy grumbling about the cup that we have to drink today, that we fail to see where we've come from. We fail to see that the cup we're drinking is actually as a result of our freedom, and so we grumble and cease to be thankful. It's the snakes that kill the Israelites. And Moses, God's solution through Moses, is for the people to confront exactly the thing that causes their illness. Do you notice that the people come to God and say, to Moses and say, tell God to take these snakes away from us. That doesn't happen. The snakes remain. Instead, there is given a way to deal. When you're bitten with the snake, look at the bronze snake on the pole. The solution is to confront the thing that caused the problem, to confront the venom, to confront the sorrow in your life. And when the Israelites do that, when they drink their cup, that they are healed. So for today, when we look at the cup, when we think about those things that you may have, that I may have mentioned earlier, the things which bring us pain, the things which we try to avoid, the things that we so often pray to God to take away from us, the reality we try to deny. Instead of fleeing it, can we turn again to it? Can we turn again to drink the cup which is before us, and to discover not only healing as we drink it, but also joy, as we look to our Saviour, who is a symbol of sorrow and brokenness on the cross. So friends, as I close off, when what we flee from no longer makes us afraid, when we are no longer trying to run, trying to turn from the sorrow, but instead we can say, this is what's before us, we're going to drink it, it becomes for us a cup of joy. Lion's going to speak about that next. And we'll discover that the cup of sorrows and the cup of joy cannot be separated, and perhaps this is the mistake that we make as we go through life. As young people, I think we probably often have this idea that sorrow isn't a part of life. We expect only good things to happen. Life is joyful. We've only known happiness. And then when bad things happen, we get disappointed, we're shocked. When things don't work out as I expect them to. And perhaps as we get older, we fall into the opposite trap. Because we've been disappointed so often, we expect only sorrows. I was speaking to someone, an older person, a number of years ago, and he said to me, back when I was young, before I had the enthusiasm kicked out of me. He didn't use the word enthusiasm, he used a swear word. But he was saying that he just doesn't have any joy in life anymore, because he doesn't expect happiness. We've been disappointed so often that we no longer expect joy. To experience, to live life to the full, to drink the cup which is before us, we need to be aware of both. We need to be aware that there will be times of sorrows, but also to know that in the times of sorrows that we encounter moments of deep, moments of true joy, joy that's not found in the material things that we often try to use to distract us. And in this we discover happiness. Because it's only when we fully realize that the cup of life is not only a cup of sorrow, but also a cup of joy, or vice versa. That it's not only a cup of joy, but also of sorrow, that we will be able to drink it, and drink it fully, and to discover the rich, meaningful life that God has for us. Amen. May we pray. And so, Lord God, as we hear this word again this morning, we have perhaps been aware of the cup of sorrow which has been before us. We've been aware of the many and different ways we've tried to escape from the cup of sorrow, to discover happiness and joy elsewhere. And yet, Lord, your call always, your call to the Israelites and your call through your Son Jesus Christ is to confront the sorrow, to go to the cross, to go to the place of grief and agony, that we can drink it fully and to discover resurrection life. And so, Lord, we pray that you'd help us to do that. Help us to know that you are with us, that we do not do it alone, but that we go in your presence, Father, with the encouragement of the Spirit, that we walk the way of Jesus, in confronting our sorrows and discovering new life through them. Help us, Lord, to do that. For we pray it in your name. Amen.
Amen.
So, friends,